Former RAF squadron leader is claiming that a Chinook helicopter that crashed in 1994 was on a show flight to try to prove to the army that it was safe. 4 crew and 25 passengers were killed when the helicopter carrying senior security personnel from RAF Aldergrove here in Northern Ireland to Fort George near Inverness went down in foggy conditions over the Mull of Kintyre. Robert Burke, who was a unit test pilot based at RAF Odium at the time of the crash, claims the flight was made as a show to prove to the army that the Mark II programme was running on time and was safe.
The RAF were desperately keen to demonstrate to the army that the Chinook Mark II conversion programme was okay, and the best possible way of demonstrating this was to fly this very important collection of service passengers and indeed civilian passengers in one Chinook Mark II helicopter. The Chinook Mark II had only just been sent to Northern Ireland to enter operational service. So this was a demonstration or show flight to all concerned, primarily the Army, that the Chinook Mark II was ready for service. Everybody I know who was involved at the time, everybody thought it was an incredibly stupid idea to put this most valuable crew in the context, crew of passengers, in the context of an internal security operation where intelligence was primary, altogether into one helicopter. None of my colleagues could understand it, and nor could a number of senior officers who I spoke to.
Well, initially the crash was blamed on pilot error, but they were exonerated in 2011. The families of the victims have been calling for the release of documents linked to the accident that were sealed for 100 years, but that has been rejected by the government. We're joined now by Patricia Conroy, who's from South Belfast and whose dad was killed in the crash, and also Mark Stevens, who's a solicitor who represents the families of those killed. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Patricia, you listen to what is being said there, those claims that have come from Robert Burke. What do you make of them?
They're totally sickening. To think that my dad, along with those other individuals, were basically guinea pigs, showcasing an aircraft that was positively dangerous, that was deemed unairworthy in previous tests, and they were sent anyway. They were sent to their death, basically, by RAF officials on a huge ego drive. And it's really, really quite devastating for us, and especially as we know there was other aircraft there at their disposal and available, but they put them on the dodgy one.
The MOD, the Ministry of Defence, have said to us that the Mull of Kintyre crash was a tragic accident, but they cannot accept the demand for establishing a new public inquiry, which has been one of the things that the families have been pushing for. They point out that the accident has already been the subject of 6 inquiries and investigations, including an independent judge-led review. Do you believe, Patricia, there is still more to discover?
Absolutely. None of that evidence that you've just talked about was available to any inquiry previous to this. We, as a very dedicated, focused group, would urge Keir Starmer to act quickly, stand up and be counted, stop hiding behind the MOD. He can overturn their decision. They refused us a public inquiry. And I'd just like to ask where his duty of candour is to us. He entered Downing Street. He talked about senior civil servants being held accountable. Well, that includes the MOD. We've waited for 31 years. And you know, we need truth and we need justice, and we deserve it.
In that statement, they also say that they understand the lack of certainty about the cause of the crash has added to the distress of the families. But that issue of documents that are sealed for 100 years, I know that has been of real concern to a lot of the relatives. And you mentioned Sir Keir Starmer. He rejected the calls and said that he didn't believe a new inquiry would bring any greater certainty or would be in the public interest. You clearly believe very differently. What do you believe is potentially contained in these documents that would make a difference to knowing them for the families?
Well, the fact that they won't open them is suspicious. My mum has already passed away. The widows will have passed away. The children will have passed away. My son will be 98 years of age in 2094. So the grandchildren will have gone. It will be so dilute. And we need to know, if there's nothing to hide, let's see them. You know, they do pertain as to the circumstances of my dad's death.
Mark Stevens, as somebody who represents so many of the relatives of those who were killed, how do you feel about this? Do you feel that any of these revelations, any of these claims are going to make a difference to how the government treats this?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think covering the platitudinous, insincere pseudo-sympathy which is coming from the Ministry of Defence, if they genuinely wanted to help, they could. They could comply with the duty of candour. They say it's unlikely that a public inquiry would identify new evidence or reach new conclusions based on the existing evidence. Well, as has just been said, the information that we've had today from retired Squadron Leader Robert Burke is absolutely essential. If it was about a show flight, and we've got to understand that this was the only Chinook Mark II helicopter operating anywhere, because this particular plane was known to be dangerous. It had bugs in the software system, it had been upgraded rather badly, and it had been grounded everywhere because it was positively dangerous. And the pilots themselves, who were wrongly blamed, asked to fly other aircraft which were known to be safe, and they were ordered onto this flight. So one of the things that's never been looked at, it was either the airworthiness of this plane. It's frankly incredible that 31 years on, we still haven't looked at what was known about the airworthiness of that particular aircraft. It's been excluded from all the previous inquiries. And indeed, when there was a crash in Afghanistan some years ago, they did include the airworthiness of the plane within the terms of reference. But that's been excluded in relation to these families. And there's other evidence which is out there. So, for example, they say it crashed onto a foggy mole. Well, the families have turned up a sea captain who was sailing across and could see that the aircraft was flying below the cloud base and could see what he could see, which was the top of the mole covered in fog, but they were flying towards it for 10 minutes before they, with clear vision. That's never come out in any of these inquiries. So why would you accidentally bump into a foggy hill if you can see it for several miles ahead of you? These were very experienced pilots. And there's much more evidence out there, and they have been hiding this evidence. They've been saying, for example, that people's privacy will be covered up. Well, that is part of the cover-up. The cover-up is the privacy of those senior officials who gave the order that this show flight should take place at all. One of the pilots was so concerned about this flight that he upped his life insurance before it. You know, these are extraordinary circumstances, and what has happened is that they've tried to avoid the critical analysis. Why were unwitting passengers and crew put on a dangerous aeroplane when there was a perfectly acceptable alternative? And worse than that, 2 people couldn't make the trip because the aircraft they decided to use, this dangerous Mark II Chinook, there was no room for them on the plane.
Although even if you take what Robert Burke has said on face value, it is clear that they believe, that those in the army did believe, that the flight was safe, that they believed this. If you take the idea that they were actually having the flight to prove that it was safe, they did have faith in that aircraft, didn't they?
No, I don't think they can have done, because what you had at the time was a tension between the army, who were basically the passengers, and the RAF. And the army didn't want to fly in this known to be dangerous aircraft. This was so dangerous that test pilots at RAF Odium, where Squadron Leader Burke was stationed, wouldn't even take it on a 20-minute no passenger flight because it was so dangerous. They wouldn't even start it up because it was so dangerous. And as a consequence of that, why on earth would you put people on it? And the first time is when someone with a bit of moral backbone and integrity, like Squadron Leader Burke, has stepped forward and said, actually, we all knew this was a problem, and it is inexplicable unless you understand it in the context of a show flight. They were trying to prove something which, frankly, backfired on them. Okay. And they've been trying to cover that up ever since.
I just want to give you a final word, Patricia, and that is just a very simple thing. You know, as someone who lost their dad in this, what sort of a difference would it make to just learn more?
I just think we've been kept in the dark. You know, we've been fed what the MOD wanted us to hear, and I think we just have a right to know. You know, yes, they were people in important jobs and important roles, but they were our dads and husbands and sons and brothers, and they were at the centre of our lives and our families.
I really
we need to know. Can I just finish? If your listeners would go to change.org/justice for the 29, please read and sign our petition. Thank you.
Patricia, I really appreciate you talking to us this morning. And Mark Stevens, thank you as well. Mark Stevens and Patricia Conroy.
It's 10 to 8.